All right, we got The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 25, Section 2, The Problem of Order 1825 to 1890. So we're looking at primarily the problem of order. We really mean governments in the Americas. So that would be North and South America. And one thing that was true was in the aftermath of both the American and the Latin American revolutions, pretty much all governments opted for some constitution. In Latin America, there were times at which many of those nations were controlled dictatorially by dictators, monarchs, or military leaders. However, though, at one point or another, you would have had a constitutional experiment in pretty much every single one of these nations. In the case of the United States, the first constitution of the US was called the Articles of Confederation. It was a very kind of loose government between the states, ultimately left the power up to the states to decide. Turned out that it wasn't strong enough to really solve the nation's problems, and so in 1789, the founders, George Washington and others, created simply the Constitution, which has in fact proved to be not just durable, but really the most durable governing document. So even the U.S. Considered to create a really stable government in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Even the U.S. had their issues of their own with the first government there. Venezuela and Chile, for example, in the first 20 years of their existence, went through something like 7 to 9 different constitutions, just to show how kind of changing this could be. Nations could essentially write constitutions every 10 years if they required. And one of the reasons where we can attribute more stability in the case of the United States and even in the case of Canada was the fact that in the English colonies had experience with elected office. The Spanish colonies had no experience. That is before the American Revolutions with elected office. And that had to do with the, sort of the differences in the way that the English colonized and the way that the Spanish colonized. Essentially, the English had kind of a head start in understanding how to deal with elections and political parties and rivalries and factions and protections against dictators and anarchy and tyranny. And so generally speaking, the countries of Latin America tended to be a little bit less durable in their constitutions. They didn't last as long. And a little bit less unstable. For example, the Constitution, it's been going on now in the U.S. here for, roughly 250 years, which makes it one of the longest lasting constitutions on the planet today, right, to give you an idea. In the case of Canada, Canada was somewhat unique in that it did not completely separate from Britain, but did get some self-government. The Confederation of 1867 pretty much banned, well, I guess that's not the right word, joined, created joined the various provinces together, and the provinces were elected with some sort of, elected official, but joined the provinces together to form we'll just say a larger government, right? A larger government. And we have a image of Canada here to kind of give you an idea of where we're talking about, but without kind of going through the whole formal breaking away part. Remained part of the British, what we call the British Commonwealth, kind of in that thing with South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, some of those other areas. In many of these nations, independence revolved around single individualists, right? We call these personalist leaders, kind of similar to the way that popular authoritarianism ruled in Europe with Napoleon, despite the fact that these were governments that were, supported and sponsored by the Enlightenment. in a lot of ways, it was really up to individuals to lead the charge. So, for example, in the United States, George Washington pretty much allowed for the Constitutional Convention to be universally recognized, the transition from the Articles to the Constitution, because Washington was there and he had that leadership ability. Most of the other founding fathers went along with that. Very similarly, Simón Bolívar, he was not only successful in defeating the Spanish, but for a time period was able to keep a lot of factions and fighting forces together in creating Gran Colombia. But oftentimes these military men turned sort of dictatorial tendencies were often referred to as caudillos. So caudillos is a military strongman who has, maybe we'll say dictatorial tendencies. Yes. That is to say, these are military leaders that people really respect, but also they use their popularity and their position within the army to, at the very least, in some cases, test the limits of government. So, for example, Andrew Jackson, who was made a war hero in the United States during the War of 1812, a war with the British, he used the veto. That is the ability for the president to strike down any sort of legislation. He used the veto more than all other presidents combined. Very popular. But, didn't go so far as to overthrow the government, whereas Jose Antonio Paez, for the most part, again, a military strongman, very successful on the battlefield, initially an ally of Simón Bolívar, broke away Venezuela. Let me see, Venezuela. I doubt that that's correct. Let me go ahead and check the spelling on that real quick. Venezuela. Venezuela, right? So I was just missing one little E there. So Jose Antonio Paez fought alongside Bolivar, eventually broke Venezuela away from Gran Colombia, and for the most part ruled Venezuela as a dictator for a lot of its early history. Another threat, I would say, was not just from these particular leaders that had charisma, had very strong kind of traditions in the military, but another strong threat, I would say, to creating orderly governments in the Americas included the various factions associated with regionalism, and we see this really all over the place. So, for example, the Republic of Central America eventually split into 5 different countries. In the case of Gran Colombia, like we said, Bolivar's dream, Venezuela broke away, Ecuador broke away. There was the separate country of Colombia, so 3 different countries were created out of Gran Colombia. In Argentina, we talked about last chapter, Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia all broke away. Argentina plus you had Chile, right? So 5 separate countries, which was initially supposed to be the Union of Rio de la Plata, again, broke up into 5 different areas. And even in the United States Civil War saw the southern states secede. It was the North versus the South, right? The Confederate States was the name for the southern states. Which broke away, right? And at least for a short time period from 1861 to 1865, that's not a 6, there were essentially 2 United States, right? The Confederate States and the United States. However, the North won, and the southern states were forced to secede, and so the states, at least in the U.S., remained united, right? The states remained united. And we have a map here kind of showing some of the ways that the United States progressively expanded westward You can see green was where it was in 1783. Then the U.S. pushed this way, the U.S. pushed this way, the U.S. pushed this way, right? The just gradual expansion westward, which the United States did. Another threat to these nations, again, the problem of order is the section title, is various foreign interventions which occurred in these years. In the case of the United States, the U.S. fought a war of 1812 against Great Britain. The Spanish-American War was to oust Spain from Cuba, which the United States successfully did from 1898. Really, just 1898 was the year of the war. So that was 2 wars the United States had with foreign countries, Britain and Cuba. In the case of Mexico, Mexico was the site of a lot of conflict. The Spanish invaded in 1829 to try and reassert their authority. The U.S. went to war with Mexico in 1846, in which Mexico lost California, Arizona, and New Mexico. Not only to add to this, we could probably also put Texan independence. The state of Texas broke away from Mexico. And then the French invasion in 1862. And that was a time period where the government in Mexico was incredibly unstable. Benito Juarez represented the Republican/constitutional faction in Mexico, and he was fighting against Emperor Maximilian, who came over he was part of a royal family in Austria, part of the Habsburg throne. He had close ties to the former Spanish king, and so he represented the monarchy. Again, you still had people in Mexico who supported the Spanish monarchy, and for a time period, the French invasion supported Emperor Maximilian against the Republican constitutional faction. Eventually, with a little bit of help from the United States, Emperor Maximilian himself was killed and assassinated, and the Republican, more constitutional faction came out. In fact, it's from this conflict that we get the holiday Cinco de Mayo. I don't know if I'm spelling that correctly, but that was a victory by Mexican forces over the French to repel the authority there. The Emperor Maximilian was executed. This happened in 1867. And lastly, in South America, the War of the Triple Alliance, which was a brutal conflict between Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, all versus the country of Paraguay. And something like, in Paraguay, 20% of the population was killed. This was in the 1860s. The U.S. Civil War was in the 1860s. So a pretty, a pretty deadly decade, right, for at least conflicts in the Americas, whether it's Mexico, the U.S., or, in Paraguay and Uruguay and down there a little bit more south. Lastly, I would say probably the final threat to the building of these nation states was the native populations and indigenous population. A lot of this turmoil gave Native Americans, and even colonial conflicts gave Native Americans opportunities to try and leverage their positions. Generally speaking, when we're talking about both North and South America, colonial government sought to limit settlement. That is to say, after the revolutions, right, the conflicts between, we'll say, revolutions led to more conflicts, right? That is to say that once colonial officials were kicked out, once British officials were kicked out of the U.S., once Spanish officials were kicked out of Latin America, then those nation states could pursue a more aggressive policy of land acquisition and ultimately put them into conflict with Native Americans. In the case of the United States, there were uprisings. Tecumseh, he was a Native American leader. He led a revolt against the U.S., ultimately failed. In the case of Andrew Jackson, under his presidency, Congress authorized the Trail of Tears, which was the forcible removal of native populations in the states, right, of which many died along the forced migration. And then after the Civil War was over, the United States continued to go to war with Native Americans like the Sioux, like the Lakota, like the Arapaho. From 1860 to 1900, there were sort of just constant clashes between the U.S. government and Native Americans. The same thing was true of Argentina and Chile, also often battled native populations. In Mexico, the Maya people created a separate independent kingdom known as the Empire of the Cross. So this would be maybe a Maya empire. Also led a revolt called the Caste War. So the Caste War is the Maya war against Mexico. And much like these other revolts, whether it was Tecumseh or the Indian Wars or the Caste War, oftentimes the national governments were far too strong for indigenous populations to resist. And ultimately, as in the case with the United States, that territory ends up being claimed by those governments.